Hello, thank you for joining on this video today. We're going to be talking about how to influence pretty much anyone or anything. A majority of this will be coming from this book, which is what the focus is of today. It's The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, with the subtitle, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. Oh, my eye is very red today. Anyway, what it is it's just a breakdown of some of the key arguments that are made in this book, and then my thoughts on that afterwards as well, and see whether or not I think it's worth reading. I'll give you a clue. If I'm thinking of making a video on it, I do think it's really worth reading, but I don't want to say spoilers. But I think it's the arguments in here, they're very well structured, they're very concise, they're very easy to follow, and I think me trying to explain them again will do it a disservice. So I'll give you a brief rundown of what is in the book, then I strongly suggest you go and have a look for the book yourself, because I really do think it's worth it. The outline of the book is talking about social epidemics, so the idea of why things become trends and how knowledge of this, which would be useful for businesses, if you want to be a social influencer or anything along those lines, or even if you're just interested in psychology and sociology, then I strongly suggest you pick up this book and do give it a good read, because it really is very interesting. The way that Gladwell describes epidemics, and I will just read directly from a quote here from the book, is epidemics are a function of the people who transmit infectious agents, the infectious agent itself, and the environment in which two infectious agents are operating. This can almost be broken down into the categories of the book, which are what Gladwell sees as the key factors that create social epidemics, such as the law of the few, the stickiness factor, and the power of context. And the reason for the book being called Tipping Point is Gladwell describes that there's a point where a social epidemic is made when this point is tipped. So when it goes from kind of growing, and it could go down at any point, growing, and then something goes over the tipping point and it's at the point of no return, essentially. So as you could already probably notice, there's a lot of talk about epidemics, like social epidemics, and they are kind of seen as, pandemics like the one we're currently in. But the way that it looks at it is it does compare the trends or social trends that occur to pandemics, and how breaking them down in this way, it brings a new sense of understanding and direction in looking at how trends are made and how people are influenced to these trends. With the quote I gave at the beginning, it talks about infectious agents, and this is where Gladwell talks about the law of the few, and how a few group of people with exceptional talents can single-handedly cause trends. He breaks them down into three different types of people. The first one being connectors, and connectors are, as it sounds, just know loads of people. They are able to get to several people and give them a certain message which kickstarts the trend, but they are the connection between all these people that statistically create the social epidemic. The next lot are called mavens by Gladwell, and these are basically knowledge hoarders. These are people that gather knowledge and love distributing it to help others, and that last point is very important, because they can just hoard a load of knowledge and then not tell anyone about it. When they are aside the connectors, not only can they reach a lot of people, they've got the knowledge necessary to be able to influence them in that way. And that also links to the third type of person that Gladwell talks about, and that is a salesperson. That is a bit more straightforward. It's someone who can sell an idea to someone, so someone who's very convincing, very persuasive. Gladwell talks about how small things like a smirk from a newsreader can influence an election. And the reason the law of the few is so important to causing these tipping points, that Gladwell argues that the social epidemics are caused by very similar to the economic rule of the 80-20 split, that 20% of the people do 80% of the work, in the sense that someone from the 80% of not the 20% of the people doing the work, if that makes sense, they could try and do what those special 20% do. So the mavens, the connectors, and the salespeople, and they just simply won't have the same influence. He uses the example of Paul Revere, yelling the British are coming, and it describes him as a very good connector and also a salesman to be able to convince a large group of people to do something, like the great leaders we think of, and compares him directly to another American who at the same time as Paul Revere was knocking on doors and doing exactly the same thing, and no one really listened to him, and he didn't know enough people to be able to connect. So it shows how important being talented in these areas is, to be able to influence social epidemics on a large scale. The second part of the argument towards social epidemics is the stickiness factor, and it sounds quite obvious. It's just how a message sticks, about how that you can spread it as much as you want, you can have as many connectors doing the best work they can as much as you want, but if the message doesn't stick, then what's the point? You could shout from the rooftops, everyone could hear you, and no one would care. This kind of links to the salesman, in the sense that the salesmen are the ones that make the message stick to people's minds necessarily. But it needs to have that stickiness factor to work. He uses the examples of kids' TV shows actually, which was very interesting, such as Sesame Street, Blue's Clues, and Dora the Explorer, and how interactivity makes a message stick with people. For example, if I ask you guys to like the video or comments especially, you're interacting, you're going to remember that more because you put your time, you put your effort into the video. And into the message that I'm trying to portray. Even if, for example, the intentions are just to get an interesting discussion going, you will remember it, and that makes the message stick more. Again, it's a lot deeper than this with Gladwell's interpretation, and this is just a very brief outline of the argument, although a concise overall description of what the argument is. So again, if you think that's interesting or you think it's useful, I'll definitely give it a read, because honestly, it was gripping, considering I don't usually get gripped by psychology, or I don't get gripped by sociology, especially, I'm interested in psychology somewhat, but how people sell things, I really couldn't care less, and this book made me go, oh, that's really interesting, and generally changed how I think, but more of that at the end. This next part of the book, I would say, is the largest part, and probably the most important in that sense, from Gladwell, and that's the power of context. It takes an idea that's not particularly groundbreaking, an idea that the environment influences how you think. It's not groundbreaking, but the way Gladwell describes it, it's very easy to follow, it makes sense, and also it asks you questions that I'll get into when we look at one of the case studies later. But again, very briefly, again, not too much detail, but my favourite part here was this broken windows theory by James Q. Wilson, who described the broken windows theory as if someone's walking down a street and they see loads of broken windows and they've not repaired over a period of time, it makes you believe that no one cares about the area, that no one's really got authority for the area, and it convinces you to cause even more deviant acts, out of society, like against societal acts, because they see, oh, no one really cares about this area, so I can do it and get away with it, essentially. And how this translated to how the cleaning of graffiti and fare dodgers in the New York subway, how tackling those two very small problems, again, it's about those very little changes, how making those changes decreased the crime rate in New York, when the crime rate itself was an epidemic. That people would go, oh, if they're enforcing it here and here, they must be enforcing it elsewhere, and it just psychologically sits with people who would possibly create those acts previously. And that takes me on to this next part of the power of context. It talks about fundamental attribution error. Again, very interesting. Doesn't necessarily link in, but it was an interesting argument, or an interesting idea, that people put absolute attributes onto people. So, oh, my sister, she's very tidy. My mum's very kind. My dad's can be angry, or something like along those lines, or saying someone is completely one thing. And the only reason we do that is because our brains can't handle everyone being on a certain part of the scale. So someone could be angry, not angry, and we all come between that, but that's too difficult to keep up with. Again, very interesting, goes into more detail in the book, but if that's something that you did, say if you're doing a paper about, psychology, I think it's great to cite that. It's just, again, for me, I just read it out of interest. And then with the power context, they also go on to how the special number of 150 people is how you influence social epidemics the best. If you get 150 people to believe in your message and become connectors, mavens, salespeople, that's how you best get your message across. And again, it's quite a long part of the book. It's not, I don't think, as necessary to the overall argument, although it does give some explanation to it. But I personally wasn't as interested, again, because I'm more interested in the thought process and the psychology as opposed to the business material that the book can be used for. He concludes this part, so before the case studies, he includes this part with, again, reiterating that it's all about these small gradual changes of people's behaviour on how to influence them. And I wrote down the conclusion that I think describes this best is, when we are trying to make an idea or attitude or product tip, we're trying to change our audience in some small yet critical respect. We're trying to infect them, sweep them up in our epidemic, convert them from hostility to acceptance. Again, not groundbreaking stuff that, changes someone slowly over time is the way that you can move them from one place to another. Big change scares people, and doing a massive change, people will just fight back against, even if they want to do it in the long run. So changing them in these small aspects and attributes is how you can influence, a group of people or even one person to your way. And again, this is essential with the stickiness factor and the law of the few for the three salesmen, mavens, and connectors. Some of the examples included, basically showing how these three factors have occurred in real life. He talks about how hush puppies became a famous shoe, which I think Gladwell concentrates a bit too much on. I think he might have done a lot of work on that and wanted to talk about it more, but I personally didn't find it as interesting. Again, if you're interested in marketing, it's fantastic, and it's worth seeing how you can make one bit of clothing really popular and make a load of money off it. The case study part that really interested me was the chapter for the case study, Suicide, Smoking, the search for the unsticky cigarette. Talking about how not only suicide became a social epidemic in Micronesia, but also how smoking is still a social epidemic and why we find it so difficult to basically stop it. With the suicides, again, there's obviously several factors, and I don't want to brush over any issue that came up during the book, but it talks about how one person, a teenage boy in Micronesia, was very had unfortunately committed suicide, and there was big reports on it, and then suddenly from that one example, loads of teenage boys kept killing themselves, which Gladwell comes to the conclusion they saw it as a form of self-expression. There was one boy who did it just because he didn't want to die, but he wanted to be kind of part of it. He wanted to be part of the movement almost, similar to something like punk rock. He links this to smoking in the West and the epidemic there through two ways. The first is, the more adults lecture their children about smoking, the more they want to do it. And he goes into loads of factors here about how the rebellious kids who younger children look up to are the ones who usually smoke, and that's why people take it, because it's the cool thing to do. And off topic, there's a very good film called Thank You for Smoking, which kind of talks about this, which I very highly recommend. It's basically, the main character is the bad guy who's trying to convince people that smoking is fine, and it just opens a question of choice, like freedom of choice, about how the freedom of choice, even if it's bad for you, is more important. If you go and watch that film and you want to read more about smoking, pick up this book and read through this case study. But another way it's linked to suicides is how it's reported. So the idea that this report of this boy who committed suicide in Micronesia reached his community because people were talking about it. Gladwell sees it as an example of a permission giver, where people go, I found myself in a similar situation, and that's what they found. You know, the boys' situation, when the situation echoed, the result would also now echo, like they had just kind of taken the tale that they'd been told about this child and made it themselves and gone, oh, okay, that sounds like me. This is what we're supposed to do, is it? Even if it was subconsciously. Again, how this can be very dangerous. The small changes can be very dangerous, and how people can almost accidentally become the salesman. They can convince others through their acts. And he goes to describe the permission givers as, it's not permission as an invitation, but as a highly detailed set of instructions. And that's why it can be dangerous. And again, it opens up questions about reporting and journalism, and why report on something here. And what hit me the most is to talk about how mental health has become much a bigger issue in the last decade or so. And is that partly because the more people talk about it, the more people see themselves as being anxious or depressed? Or is it that we're more aware of the symptoms, and we've just been misdiagnosing depression and anxiety as people who are shy and just sad previously? The book talks about, you know, again, from how hush puppies are being sold to how people are killed through, you know, social epidemics of suicides. It ranges, you know, from here to there. It ranges so widely, and if any of it really interests you, I do recommend getting The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. Even if you're only interested in part of it, I got mine in a charity shop for like £1, and it was just, I'd seen the person before, I'd seen the author before in Talking to Strangers, which is advertised everywhere on any good bookshop. I see it in Waterstones a lot, and I've not read it, but I definitely will be picking it up. If there's anything like this, you will find parts of it don't echo with you, or parts of it don't resonate with you as much as others, but the parts that did, such as the case study that I described, and also how social epidemics are made, were definitely worth it. So yeah, well, I hope that did grip your interest. It set you thinking about things you don't necessarily think about, and I'd love to know what you think. So again, stickiness factor coming in here, but do please put, you know, your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear if I interpreted it wrong, if you have read the book, or if I've interpreted it correctly. Again, please let me know. If you like this style of video, please leave a like, and it lets me know, and I can do more around that. Or if you also like these videos, do subscribe. But apart from that, thank you for joining me. Okay, take care.